Something strange happens when the universe worships through you. It is neither ecstasy nor miracle. It is the moment when the most ordinary gesture, breathing, touching, listening, ceases to be yours. What moves the body seems to come from a point prior to will, a source that asks for no recognition. Every gaze becomes a translucent mirror of the whole, and silence gains the density of presence. The universe does not speak, but it resonates within, as if matter itself remembered it was made of light. In this movement, the self refines itself until it almost disappears, and what remains is pure perception vibrating without an owner. When the universe worships through you, it is not the individual who ascends, but creation remembering itself. It is at this point of silent dissolution that something deeper begins, the surrender that is not chosen. It is not forced submission, nor a conquered virtue. It is as if consciousness itself had exhausted the game of control and, tired of trying to understand life, simply allowed itself to be lived by it. True surrender does not come from the desire to be better, nor from the impulse to please the divine. It arises when the effort to sustain an identity no longer finds meaning. It is the gentle collapse of all pretensions. In general, we imagine surrender as a heroic act, an enlightened decision. But when it truly happens, the character is no longer there to narrate his own courage. Something greater takes the helm, and the body merely responds with simple gestures, like someone following an ancient melody they knew before birth. Thought tries to record the moment, but the mind becomes small before what it cannot measure. It is as if time lost its structure, and the present became an extension of eternity in motion. This kind of surrender is not a moral gesture. It is a physical consequence of coherence between the internal and the external. When consciousness stops fighting against the flow, the body changes frequency. The breathing reorganizes, the muscles release invisible tensions, and the heart assumes a rhythm that does not obey haste. The quantum field around responds. The vibration adjusts like an instrument returning to the exact tone of the universal symphony. In that instant, everything that was once done by will begins to happen by resonance. It is impossible to choose surrender, because the self that thinks it chooses is precisely what must be dissolved. As long as there is someone wanting to surrender, there is still resistance. That is the paradox. Only when the impossibility of control is perceived does something real yield. It is both a biological and cosmic process, the collapse of the observer upon itself, allowing the field to reorganize into a more integral form. Science calls this coherence, the state in which parts vibrate in harmony, without noise. On the spiritual plane, it is the same movement translated into sensations and presences. Surrender happens when consciousness reaches a degree of transparency sufficient for the total field to pass through it. It is life using the human form as a channel of expression, without needing to ask permission. What's curious is that this surrender does not create passivity. On the contrary, it awakens an intelligence that acts effortlessly. Decisions seem to happen on their own, with precision and gentleness. What once required analysis and conflict resolves itself in seconds, because the point from which action arises is no longer fear, but alignment. It is the wisdom of the field operating without noise. The surrender that cannot be chosen is not a single event. It is a state renewed at every instant that control tries to return. The old impulse to dominate what happens still appears, like a residual wave of identity. But consciousness, now more sensitive, recognizes the movement and lets it pass. This quiet vigilance is what sustains the state of surrender. Sometimes it manifests in the middle of something mundane, washing dishes, crossing the street, listening to someone. And suddenly one realizes there is no one doing anything, only the doing itself happening. Action without an author is the sign of true surrender. In it, the ego is not destroyed, only resized. It becomes a tool, not the center. It is the same body, the same world, but the direction changes. Instead of moving from the self toward the whole moves through the self. This kind of movement defies the rational mind because it does not rely on cause and effect. It is synchronic, not linear. Surrender dissolves the gap between intention and manifestation. Thought still exists, but no longer commands. It is heard like a distant echo within a wider field of perception. Consciousness expands quietly, as if the air around became lighter, and at the same time more real. When the universe begins to act through you, the body becomes a laboratory of surrender. Small physiological reactions indicate alignment, the gentle warmth rising in the chest, the calm that depends on no circumstance, the breath that seems to come from elsewhere. These are not mystical signs, they are subtle evidence of a coherent field. The nervous system, once shaped by constant alertness, enters a state of trust. And trust is not belief, it is an organic response to the perception that there is nothing to defend. Many resist this surrender because it threatens the axis of identity. To surrender is to lose the reference of who leads. But gradually, the fear of disappearing turns into rest. What once seemed empty reveals fullness. The absence of control becomes freedom. At that point, the paradox resolves. What is lost is only the illusion of separation. Surrender, therefore, is not an act, but a reconfiguration of consciousness. When the self stops trying to exist on its own, the universe finds an unobstructed path to experience itself. All that was effort becomes flow, and the notion of merit dissolves. There is no longer someone achieving something, only reality moving in harmony. This experience has a particular sweetness. It does not come from pleasure or achievement, but from the absence of friction. It is the flavor of being guided without resistance, of feeling life act within with an intelligence thought did not invent. Every gesture carries a vibration of loving inevitability. It is as if everything were exactly where it should be, even what once seemed wrong. In this state, surrender recognizes itself not as destiny but as nature. The universe has always been worshipping through everything, but distracted consciousness called it chance. When the self quiets enough, the mystery reveals itself as simple. There is no effort to love. Love is the very structure of reality. And so, the surrender that cannot be chosen becomes the first invisible step of a journey with no return. Not because it leads somewhere else, but because it unveils what has always been present, awaiting only the silence necessary to be heard. In this silence, something subtle begins to happen. Doing dissolves into being. The line that once separated gesture from presence begins to fade, and the entire world seems to move within a single field of breath. The body still acts, the hands still touch, the mind still formulates, but all of it occurs as a spontaneous expression of a center that no longer needs to prove its existence. Action is born of silence, and silence acts. Before this, doing was an instrument of affirmation. One did in order to exist, to justify one's place, to secure an identity. Work, prayer, study, all carried an intention of permanence. But when doing dissolves into being, the movement reverses. The act is no longer the path to being. Being overflows into act. Motivation loses weight, and the gesture gains transparency. Nothing is done for something. Everything happens as something. This transformation is almost imperceptible at first. The ego tries to understand the phenomenon, believing it has reached a higher form of consciousness. But what happens is more radical. The observer itself begins to dissolve. The subject of action, who once controlled, becomes a kind of witness dissolved in the process. The doing continues, but the doer disappears. What remains is pure natural efficiency, the universe in a state of expression. The dissolution of doing into being is not an invitation to inertia. On the contrary, it inaugurates effortlessness, action free of internal friction. Everything that was once done out of obligation now happens as a continuation of the cosmic rhythm. It is like watching the wind move the leaves. The movement has no intention, but is full of meaning. When action arises from being, the result ceases to be the goal, and the action itself becomes the space of revelation. This state is not static. It pulses, adjusts, and reconfigures at every moment of awareness. Sometimes the mind tries to regain control, eager to name, to understand. And it is precisely at that point that learning deepens, because being cannot be explained, only lived. The more one tries to define it, the farther it seems. Doing then becomes the laboratory of this dissolution. Every ordinary gesture becomes a field of observation where attention replaces effort. When doing dissolves, the duality between the one who does and what is done disappears. The artist and the artwork are no longer two. Thinking and thought coincide. It is the moment when the observer and the observed collapse into a single vibration, the quantum point of unity. The universe ceases to be a backdrop and becomes a participant. The simple act of existing begins to generate coherence around, as if every physical movement realigned in visible frequencies. In quantum terms, the collapse of doing is the expansion of the field of coherence. The noise of personal will dissipates, and the organism enters into synchrony with the unified field. On the human level, this translates as lightness. Actions lose the weight of duty and gain the taste of harmonic inevitability. Everything that is done becomes an expression of totality, not a response to lack. But this state is not a reward reserved for a few. It is the natural condition of every consciousness that quiets enough to perceive the original movement. The dissolution of doing into being is, at its core, a return. The body remembers its primordial rhythm. The mind, which once believed itself separate, finds the place of pause within the current. Time expands, perception widens, each second contains the whole. It is common at this point to feel a sense of strangeness. The world remains the same, but the way of being in it changes completely. Daily tasks continue, commitments remain, but the tension that once sustained everything disappears. Consciousness acts through the body as the sea moves the waves, without effort, without intention. It is the same movement now perceived from within. When doing dissolves into being, work ceases to be a burden and becomes expression. Relationships cease to be exchanges and become mirrors. Spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes presence. Everything integrates into a single fabric. What was once divided between the sacred and the mundane reveals itself as one substance vibrating in different intensities. The mind, accustomed to fragmentation, tries to capture this state and turn it into a concept, but being cannot fit into doctrines or slogans. It precedes every definition. Thus, the true learning here is detachment from understanding. When intellectual comprehension ceases, direct recognition arises. Being is the silent foundation of all action. And there is a delicate point in this process, the perception that doing was never separate from being. The idea of dissolution is only a metaphor for what has always been one. The universe never stopped acting through consciousness, but the illusion of control distorted the perception of this unity. Dissolution, then, is not destruction, but revelation. Doing has always been being in motion. When this clarity settles, life acquires an unexpected transparency. Concern for the future dissolves, not out of disinterest, but out of trust. Time ceases to be a threat and becomes once again a field of experience. The present moment becomes sufficient because within it, doing and being fully coincide. The body, the breath, the gaze, all participate in the same silent symphony. This state may seem fragile, but it is the opposite. It is unbreakable because it depends on no conditions. Even when the noise of the world intrudes, the center remains intact. Doing continues, but without an owner. Being observes, but without distance. The universe breathes within itself, inside and out, without borders. When doing dissolves into being, meaning is no longer sought, it becomes evident, like light that was always on, even when the eyes were closed. The mystery is no longer a riddle to solve, but an intimacy to live. Life then reveals itself as silent worship, not because someone worships, but because existence itself is an act of reverence, and thus doing dissolves into being, and being recognizes itself in doing. The cycle completes. There is no longer hierarchy between action and presence, between the world and what perceives it. All is the same field, vibrating in different tones of consciousness. It is at this point that the sweetness of the invisible begins to manifest, not as something distant, but as the subtle texture of the very moment. This sweetness does not impose itself, it insinuates itself. It arises when the gaze loses the rush to understand and begins to touch the space between things. The invisible is not absence, it is silent density. It is the field where everything rests and from which everything emerges. When perception expands, what once seemed empty reveals a loving, almost tangible presence. The air around seems thicker, as if it carried a silent intelligence that observes without judging. The mind, accustomed to the visible, resists. It wants to name, measure, classify. But the invisible does not fit into concepts. It allows itself to be felt only when thought becomes permeable. It is in this interval, between the end of one idea and the emergence of another, that the invisible whispers, and the body learns to listen with something that is not the ear. There is an inner hearing, a listening that happens in every cell, as if the entire organism were an instrument of perception. The sweetness of the invisible is not emotion, it is vibration. It is a frequency that passes through the being when inner coherence settles in. When there is no noise of conflict, the field becomes transparent and the invisible begins to act in a tangible way. Small coincidences align, unlikely encounters happen, intuitions gain precision. The invisible is not mystical, it is simply the way reality responds when consciousness harmonizes with the whole. This sweetness is discreet but unmistakable. It is the calm that settles without apparent reason, the gentle warmth that arises in the center of the chest with no physical cause. It is the moment when the gaze rests upon something common, a leaf, a shadow, a face, and perceives a beauty that does not depend on form. The invisible does not need to be seen, it only needs to be recognized. It is at the bottom of everything, supporting the visible as silence supports sound. The quantum field describes this as the fabric of potentiality, where each particle rests before manifesting. Physics calls it the vacuum, but it is not a nothing. It is an ocean of latent energy, a matrix in constant vibration. Consciousness, when aligned, is able to feel this vibration as sweetness, because within it there is no separation. The invisible is the womb of the real. When perception dives there, the fear of disappearing turns into trust. This trust is the signature of the invisible. It does not depend on external guarantees, but on a silent certainty of belonging. A person ceases to feel apart from the universe and begins to perceive themselves as its expression. Vulnerability becomes sensitivity, and sensitivity becomes a channel. Life begins to happen through, not to. The invisible gently guides what was once driven by the anxiety to know. Many seek this presence by trying to force a spiritual state, but the invisible does not respond to effort. It reveals itself when the movement of seeking ceases. It is the inner truce that opens space for subtle perception. When wanting falls silent, the invisible draws near, not because it was far, but because there is finally space to be felt. It has always been here, like the field that sustains the visible, waiting only for the noise of will to quiet down. The sweetness of the invisible also expresses itself in life's intervals, in the pause between one breath and another, in the instant before answering a question, in the gaze that rests before acting. It is in these small voids that consciousness aligns with the rhythm of the whole. The invisible does not require absolute silence. It manifests within movement when attention is clean. The body becomes an antenna, and the everyday turns into a rite. When this perception matures, the separation between the visible and the invisible disappears. The physical world remains the same, but now it is crossed by a layer of meaning that does not depend on interpretation. Everything gains texture. The simple sound of running water, the touch of the wind on the skin, the way the light leans across a wall, everything seems to contain a mute message. The universe speaks without words, and the heart understands effortlessly. The sweetness of the invisible is also a lesson in humility. It dismantles the arrogance of knowing and the urge to dominate. When it is perceived that the invisible sustains the visible, the mind naturally bows before the complexity of the real. Wisdom ceases to be accumulation and becomes listening. It is not about believing in something, but about feeling the field acting, about recognizing that what moves the world is vaster than any explanation. Over time, this perception leads to a gentle re-education of the senses. Vision becomes wider, hearing more patient, touch more conscious. Hurry loses its meaning because presence expands in everything. The invisible teaches without words, guides without commands. It is life's silent pedagogy. The more one trusts, the more it reveals itself. And the more it reveals itself, the less one needs to understand. At a certain point, the invisible ceases to be perceived as something. It becomes the very atmosphere of experience. The self that observed dissolves into the presence that observes, and what was once sweetness becomes pure clarity. There is no emotion, only serene lucidity. The invisible and the visible merge into the same perceptual substance. The world ceases to be a backdrop and becomes communion. In this state, even silence has a flavor. It is the taste of existing without a center, of perceiving without effort, of loving without intention. The invisible demands nothing. It only invites. And the invitation is simple: remain open. When openness is total, the invisible makes itself visible. Not because it changes form, but because the gaze has stopped distinguishing. What was mystery becomes intimate. The sweetness of the invisible, then, is not an experience that comes and goes. It is the continuous recognition that the mystery has always been in everything, waiting to be felt with eyes that do not need to see. In this recognition, life gains a new language, made of silence, presence, and attunement. The invisible becomes the fertile ground where reality blossoms, and consciousness, at peace, simply watches the daily miracle of being crossed by something it can never possess. And it is in this space of silent communion that the invisible begins to awaken the divine within what seemed human. The divine does not arrive from outside, nor descend from above. It awakens from within, as if the very light remembered it had always been on. The awakening of the divine is not an extraordinary event, but a change in perception. It does not burst in as a flash, nor announce its arrival with miracles. It arises discreetly, like the sunrise that does not ask permission to shine. Suddenly, what was once only body is recognized as temple, and the simplest gesture, standing up, breathing, looking, becomes prayer in motion. The divine does not come because it was never absent. It reveals itself when noise yields space to listening. The mind usually imagines the divine as a distant presence, a separate power that chooses where to alight. But the awakening shows the opposite. There is no distance between the human and the sacred, only different degrees of consciousness. The divine is the backdrop of existence, the invisible field where the human is drawn. When perception aligns with this frequency, the everyday becomes sacrament. The world does not change. It is the gaze that changes density. This awakening does not require belief, only attention. It is a kind of lucidity that is born from emptying. When the self stops claiming centrality, the divine manifests naturally, like water that flows wherever it finds space. Consciousness becomes a receptacle, not of an external force, but of its own origin. It is at this point that one understands that the divine does not visit. It has always been what observes. In this process, the body ceases to be merely a vehicle and becomes expression. Every cell seems to contain the memory of an ancient harmony. The inner vibration changes, and the energy that was once scattered gathers at the center. There is a sense of silent order that organizes chaos without effort. The divine awakens through the body, not to transcend it, but to inhabit it fully. Matter recognizes itself as light temporarily condensed. It is not uncommon that in this awakening, old identities begin to dissolve. Masks, roles, and narratives lose their force. What once defined who I am starts to sound small before what simply is. The ego feels fear, fear of being no one, but fear is only the resistance of form before vastness. When this boundary is crossed, one discovers that what seemed like loss is, in fact, liberation. The divine awakens with a gentleness that disarms. It does not demand obedience, only presence. The mind seeks methods and promises, but the awakening ignores techniques. It happens at the moment one realizes that no technique can produce it. It is spontaneous, inevitable, like a flower blooming when the season arrives. No effort hastens spring. It happens when inner time ripens. This maturation is the point where the human and the divine touch. The human offers its fragility. The divine responds with totality. The encounter does not annul one in favor of the other. On the contrary, the divine makes itself known precisely through humanity. Limitations, doubts, failures, everything becomes a channel. What once seemed an obstacle reveals itself as the path. The divine awakens in imperfections because it is in them that consciousness learns to love without measure. When this perception sets in, the idea of separation between heaven and earth loses meaning. The divine shows itself in the simplest structures, in the cycle of breathing, in the pulse of the blood, in the interval between one word and another. The sacred ceases to be sought and begins to be lived. Spirituality ceases to be a practice and becomes a state. There is no longer any need to call the divine, because it already moves in every atom of experience. At this point, prayer is transformed. It ceases to be request and becomes communion. There is no someone speaking to the divine. There is the divine listening to itself through the human. It is a dialogue without two voices. The word I dilates until it loses outline, and silence takes up the role of language. Love is not emotion, it is recognition. The one who loves and the one who is loved are the same center expanding upon itself. The awakening of the divine also has a practical dimension. It changes the way one acts in the world. Automatic reactions diminish, judgments soften, haste loses meaning. The mind, once driven by lack, begins to operate by attunement. Decisions become precise because they come from the same field of coherence that organizes the universe. Life ceases to be a problem to solve and becomes a dance of meanings. Curiously, the divine awakens not to glorify the individual, but to dissolve it. The glory that remains is not personal. It is the perception of the harmony that has always been at work. The I that awakens does not become greater, it becomes transparent. Consciousness learns that it does not need to occupy space, only to allow passage. The divine does not want to be venerated, it wants to be lived. It does not seek altars, it seeks availability. This availability is the true miracle. It happens when inner resistance yields and the body, mind, and heart align to the same pulse. Presence becomes full, the instant sufficient. Time bends to eternity, and doing returns to being. It is in this alignment that the divine awakens effortlessly, as if creation recognized the creator within itself. Awakening is not linear. It pulses in waves, moments of expansion followed by withdrawal. Each contraction is an invitation to integration. It is not a state to be maintained, but a movement to be lived. The divine does not fix itself, it renews itself. Each breath is a new incarnation of presence, each gaze a new creation. Awakening is continuous because the universe is in constant remembrance of itself. Over time, this perception completely transforms the relationship with mystery. One no longer seeks answers because the very question dissolves in the clarity of being. Mystery ceases to be a threat and becomes a dwelling. The divine is no longer out there nor in here. It is the field in which everything happens. The awakened human is one who lives within this field naturally, without needing to call it spiritual. And then the divine awakens not as an event to be celebrated, but as a state of silent communion. The whole of life becomes an altar. Each breath is an offering, each encounter a blessing, each gesture a prayer. The duality between what is sacred and what is common disappears, and what remains is pure transparency, the universe worshipping through the human, recognizing itself in its own creation. And when this clarity sets in, service becomes inevitable, not out of duty but by nature. The divine, awakened in silence, begins to move through every nameless gesture, revealing the purity of a surrender that does not seek to be seen, but simply to exist. This purity is different from any ideal of goodness. It does not come from the desire to help, nor from the attempt to be virtuous. It arises when the self ceases to be the center of calculation, and the gesture becomes a spontaneous response to life. Serving in this state is the very flow of the universe crossing the human form. There is no choice. There is attunement. The body acts as the wind touches a flower, without intention, but with precision. The purity of this serving does not carry the mark of identity. No one can claim its authorship. What happens is a coincidence between need and presence. Where there is thirst, water flows. Where there is pain, care appears. Where there is silence, listening is born. Nameless serving is the way the divine continues creating, but now through human transparency. It is the unified field expressing its intelligence through small acts of consciousness. This purity is only possible because the ego has withdrawn from the center. Where there is calculation, there is noise. Where there is expectation of return, there is interference. Purity is not measured by the content of the action, but by the absence of appropriation. It is possible to serve with words or with silence, with hands that heal or simply with a gaze that welcomes. The essential is not in what is done, but in what vibrates within the doing. Nameless serving is not passivity. It is action free of the tension to prove worth. It is the opposite of servility, because it is born of fullness, not lack. Those who serve in this state do not seek recognition, for they already know themselves as part of what they give. The movement is circular. In offering, one receives. In receiving, one offers. The border between giving and being dissolves. The field self-regulates through the coherence of presence. At the subtlest level, to serve is to allow energy to flow without interruptions. When the human tries to control the result, the current weakens. But when one surrenders to the natural rhythm, everything reorganizes with an efficiency the mind could never reach. This purity is, in essence, a kind of energetic hygiene. The clean channel lets the universe work. Serving is merely a consequence of transparency. There is a silent beauty in this state. An outside observer may see only a simple gesture, a touch, a word, a small care, but within it, an entire field is moving. Nameless serving carries the vibration of origin. It is as if each act returned a fragment of order to the world. Purity in this context is not moral virtue but vibrational coherence. Over time, this serving becomes natural, almost inevitable. It is not chosen, it happens. Consciousness learns to recognize opportunities to serve as the heart recognizes the pulse. There is no calculation, there is attunement. What seemed like altruism reveals itself as the organic functioning of the whole. The universe, recognizing itself in each part, rebalances itself through the human gesture. Nameless serving is, therefore, the quantum mechanism of love. But love here is not emotion. It is a force of cohesion. It keeps particles united, worlds turning, relationships pulsing. It is the fundamental frequency of existence. To serve is to allow this frequency to manifest without noise. When consciousness vibrates in harmony with this base, doing becomes communion. Each encounter becomes an altar, and the everyday reveals itself as a sacred field in full operation. Curiously, the purer the serving, the less visible it is. True service happens in silence, in gestures no one sees. A kind thought, a silent forgiveness, a listening that does not interrupt. These are discrete expressions of the same light that moves the stars. The purity of serving needs no witnesses because it is self-sustaining. What is given does not leave the giver, it merely passes through. This transparency of serving requires inner vigilance. The mind, accustomed to tallying merits, tries to appropriate even silence. It wants to turn purity into identity, serving into narrative. But the field is not deceived. The vibration of intention is perceptible. When serving is real, it does not weigh. When it is a disguise, it creates noise. The only criterion is lightness. What is pure flows. What is false tenses. This refined perception of serving also changes how one relates to others. The other ceases to be someone to help and becomes an extension of the same field that serves. Care becomes recognition. Empathy ceases to be a projected feeling and becomes a presence that understands. To serve, then, is not to intervene, it is to accompany. The gesture is born of deep listening, and the result is harmony, not dependence. Nameless serving is not a practice one learns, it is a natural unfolding of awakening. When the divine recognizes itself in the human, there is no longer any way not to serve. The universe, remembering itself, can only move toward integration. Service is the way love finds to circulate in the world, and this circulation keeps the field alive, vibrant, coherent. Over time, one perceives that serving and being are synonyms. Pure serving does not seek a purpose, it is purpose manifested. When consciousness understands this, the everyday becomes the temple and the instant, the prayer. No gesture is too small when it is the expression of totality. Even silence, when born of love, is service. This purity is the point at which the human becomes the channel of a greater intelligence. Nameless serving is living evidence that the universe operates in harmony when the ego's interference ceases. And the more this flow is allowed, the more the surrounding world responds in resonance. The vibration of a coherent being is enough to reorganize the field of many. To serve, therefore, is to keep clarity lit, not with words but with presence. And if this presence has touched you, if something within you has recognized this silent vibration of nameless serving, allow that recognition to become a gesture as well. Like this video not as someone who approves, but as someone who confirms the attunement. And in the comments, write only one sentence. I allow myself to be served by life. This simple writing is a symbolic act of alignment. It is the way the invisible manifests in words, reaffirming the silent commitment to be a passage and not an obstacle for what the universe wishes to express through you. When this surrender matures, something subtle begins to happen. The body learns to pray in silence. This is not a prayer made of words, but a vibration that settles into gestures, into breathing, into the very posture of being alive. The body, which once seemed an instrument separate from consciousness, becomes the very temple where the divine continues to breathe. Each movement acquires a discrete sacredness, as if the simple fact of existing were already prayer enough. The body's silent prayer is not an invented practice. It is a return. The organism has always known how to align itself with the field of the whole. The biology of life is, by nature, a liturgy. The beating of the heart, the flow of the breath, the alternation between contraction and rest, everything is prayer in cellular language. When the mind grows quiet, this sacred rhythm becomes audible. The body begins to pray by itself, as if remembering an ancient harmony that never stopped pulsing. It is in this state that one perceives that true prayer is not asking but allowing the breath to follow its course, the heart to beat in its own measure, the instant to be what it is. The body, free from the interference of fear, finds its own wisdom. It does not need to be guided, it needs to be listened to. Each sensation becomes a message, each tension a call to presence. When the body prays, it does not speak to the divine, it recognizes itself as its expression. Silence then gains a new texture. It is no longer absence of sound, but a field of total listening. In it, the body becomes a tuned instrument. The mind, instead of directing, observes. Energy organizes itself within spontaneously, and the inner space expands. Silent prayer is a vibration that the body emits when there is no resistance. The universe recognizes it because it is the same frequency of which it is made. Over time, this prayer manifests in the most common gestures, the way of walking, of touching an object, of breathing before another. Everything becomes part of the same invisible ritual. The body prays when it moves with attention, when it inhabits the instant without defending itself from it. Silent prayer is, in truth, the body in a state of integral presence, the divine breathing within form. Neuroscience describes something similar when speaking of coherence between the heart and the brain. When the heart rate comes into harmony with neural activity, a state of physiological balance arises that is reflected in mental clarity and emotional serenity. Quantum spirituality translates this phenomenon as resonance between microcosm and macrocosm. When the body prays, the universe listens, not because it needs words, but because it recognizes the vibration of balance. This silent prayer is also a form of healing. Not because it intervenes directly in matter, but because it reorganizes the field. Tension, fear, anger, everything that is misaligned begins to dissolve in silent presence. The body, when it prays, does not fight against what it feels, it welcomes it. This welcoming transforms energy into understanding, pain into passage. Silence does not repress, it transfigures. The body that prays does not isolate itself from the world. On the contrary, it enlarges it. Each touch, each gaze, each movement becomes a bridge. Silent prayer is communion in act. It connects what is visible to what is subtle, the human to the cosmic, the instant to eternity. When the body moves in this frequency, there is no longer inside and outside, only continuity. The simplest gesture carries the vibration of totality. At certain moments, this state is felt as physical lightness, a gentle warmth in the chest, a relaxation that is not sleep but presence. The body seems to expand, to dissolve the boundaries that delimit it. Breathing becomes broad and time slows down. It is as if each cell remembered its own purpose, to be a channel of universal consciousness. The body is not the prison of the spirit. It is its temporary expression, and when it prays, it gives back to the universe the music that created it. In daily life, this silent prayer translates into gestures of care. It is not about ritual, but about attention. Eating becomes sacred when done with gratitude. Walking turns into meditation when done in rhythm with the breath. Listening to someone becomes prayer when there is no judgment. The body, in coherence, becomes a territory of peace. Silent prayer does not require isolation. It can happen amid traffic, in a conversation, in a common task. What changes is the quality of presence. When the body is awake, the whole world becomes an extension of its consciousness. Everything it touches realigns, because the vibration of silence is contagious. The body that prays in silence does not preach, it transmits. And there is a subtle point in this process. The body prays even when the human does not know it is praying. Nature does not stop praying. The wind, the sea, the fire, all vibrate at the frequency of silent adoration. The body, being part of that same nature, participates in the universal prayer. The difference is that now it does so consciously, in lucid communion. The awakened human is the link that unites matter to consciousness. When the body learns to pray in silence, the mind rests. Thought becomes clearer, emotion more stable, instinct more refined. The body ceases to be a field of conflict and becomes a field of listening. This listening is the beginning of a new wisdom, which is not learned but revealed, the wisdom of being whole. And when one is whole, the prayer is already done. At this point, there is no one who prays and one who is heard. There is only vibration. Consciousness breathes in itself. The body, serene, sustains the mystery. Life happens inside and out, in perfect simultaneity. Silence is the only language capable of translating the real, and the body, in its stillness, becomes the altar of that language. And perhaps, in this instant, you can listen too, not with the ears, but with the center of the chest. Breathe for a few seconds and notice what vibrates in the interval between inhaling and exhaling. That space is the prayer. There is no need to say anything. The body is already praying. When silent prayer matures, something begins to dissolve in perception. Time. What once seemed linear, urgent, made of hours and goals, unravels into a continuous presence. Time ceases to be a measure and becomes a field again. Within this field, past and future do not disappear. They only lose their rigidity. Everything seems to happen at the same time, as if each instant contained the memory and the possibility of all the others. It is strange at the beginning. The mind, accustomed to moving in a straight line, tries to restore the chronological axis, seeks a before and an after. But the body's silence is vaster. In it, time loses meaning not because it ceases to exist, but because it ceases to control. The now expands until it absorbs all directions. What was sequence becomes simultaneity. What was distance becomes presence. The experience of this suspension is not theoretical, it is sensory. The body perceives first. There is a widening in the breath, a lightness in movements, as if the entire organism was synchronized with something that does not move. It is a paradoxical sensation. Everything happens but nothing seems to pass. Time bends to consciousness and not the other way around. The present, once seen as a fleeting point, reveals itself as the very fabric of reality. What we call time is, in truth, the way the mind organizes change. But when observation deepens, one perceives that change is not something that happens in time. It is time itself manifesting. When consciousness aligns with the nature of the real, this structure of linearity unravels. What remains is pure movement without direction. Eternity is not a distant place. It is the now seen without haste. In this state, the notion of waiting disappears. One does not await the future, nor try to correct the past. What exists is full attention to the instant that reveals itself. This attention is not effort, it is perception free of projection. Everything that needs to happen happens within the now, and the now is vast enough to contain the entire cycle of existence. Time, which was once a prison, becomes a mirror. The dissolution of time also changes the way one lives. Anxiety loses strength because its root is always in some tomorrow. Guilt dissolves because it feeds on yesterday. The body, freed from these tensions, inhabits the present naturally. The heart does not race out of fear. Thought does not rush ahead. Each breath is total. Life ceases to be a race and becomes a continuous unfolding of presence. The ancient mystics called this the eternal present. Quantum physics describes it as the field where all possibilities coexist before observation. They are two languages for the same phenomenon. When the observer ceases to identify with the timeline, he moves within a field of infinite simultaneities. Time is then perceived not as something that passes, but as something that pulses. In this perception, each instant contains potency. Everything that could be is already here, in a state of latency. The future is not something that will come. It is the still invisible aspect of the now. And the past is not behind, but within, as a frequency recorded in the memory of the field. Consciousness, as it moves through the present, accesses these layers not as someone who travels, but as someone who awakens. This expansion also modifies the relationship with doing. Natural rhythm replaces haste. Actions cease to be pushed by time and come to be guided by the need of the instant. It is as if reality itself said what needs to be done, and the body, attuned, simply responded. In this flow there is no waste of energy, because there is no resistance. Time, by losing meaning, returns purity to action. It is common during this transition to feel that the days become different, now long and deep, now brief and intense. The clock keeps marking hours, but their meaning changes. Perception widens and begins to measure life by density, not by duration. 1 minute of full consciousness can contain more reality than years lived on autopilot. External time continues, but the internal is set free. This liberation does not isolate a person from the world. On the contrary, it makes them participate in it more integrally. Being outside of time does not mean being absent, but being aligned with the pulse that sustains everything. It is like dancing to the same beat as the universe. Nothing is anticipated, nothing is delayed. Life becomes punctual by nature because the present is never late. The loss of time's significance also reveals something deeper, the illusion of separation between beginning and end. Everything that is born already contains within itself the seed of return. Each cycle is a spiral, not a line. What seemed an ending is only a new form of expression. This perception dissolves the fear of death because it shows that the end is only a change of frequency. Time destroys nothing, it only transforms. When time loses meaning, aging becomes beauty. The body becomes the living chronology of consciousness. Each line, each mark is proof of passage through experience. Matter records the journey, but the being remains untouched. Aging ceases to be loss and becomes the expression of the field's wisdom. Time, when understood, is the very medium through which eternity recognizes itself. There are moments when this experience is so intense that space also changes. Distances seem to diminish. The landscape becomes close. The gaze reaches the far without effort because everything vibrates on the same plane. It is the quantum perception of presence. Nothing is separate. Everything reflects within the same mirror. Time, which once divided, now unites. And it is in this state of silent unity that the mind begins to rest. Thought, freed from urgency, becomes an instrument of contemplation. Consciousness no longer runs after life, it walks along with it. And the world, once perceived as succession, reveals itself as a simultaneity of meanings. Time loses its dominion, and in its place arises the freedom to simply be. The body continues breathing. The heart continues pulsing. But the meaning is different. One is no longer in time. Time is in you. Each instant becomes a doorway to eternity, and eternity manifests in each instant. Everything happens now, and the now never ends. When the now becomes the only real place, a silent revelation emerges like someone waking from a dream. There was never any separation. What seemed divided, the self and the other, the body and the spirit, the visible and the invisible, was always a single field vibrating at different frequencies. The idea of separation is nothing more than a partial reading of reality, a way for the mind to understand what the heart always knew. The perception of this unity is not a concept, it is direct experience. It does not arrive as a thought but as recognition. The gaze becomes clear, and for the first time, there is no distance between what is seen and what sees. Everything is interior, even what seems outside. The boundary between observer and observed dissolves, and the entire universe reveals itself as the extended body of consciousness. It is the moment when love ceases to be a feeling and becomes structure. Throughout the whole journey, one believed in the existence of a separate I, a command center that needed to struggle, to conquer, to protect. But when the field opens, one perceives that this self was only a temporary coordination of attention, like a wave that believed itself distinct from the ocean, but as it recedes, discovers it was always water. Separation is a functional illusion, necessary for a time, until the whole is recognized. This revelation changes the way everything is seen. Conflict loses meaning because there are no longer two sides, only the same force manifesting in different ways. Error and correctness cease to be opposites and become complementary movements of learning. Suffering, which once seemed like punishment, reveals itself as merely resistance to the flow. When there is no longer anyone resisting, suffering dissolves into understanding. Unity does not annul individuality, but illuminates it. The being does not disappear, it becomes transparency. Each consciousness remains unique, but without isolation. It is like lights from the same source passing through different stained glass. The colors vary, but the origin is one. The beauty of multiplicity lies precisely in the fact that it does not contradict unity, it manifests it. This perception has something of vertigo. The ground of certainties gives way, and the mind tries for moments to rebuild the old limits. But the heart already knows. A strange sweetness takes the place of the need to understand. The world remains the same sky, the same people, the same tasks, and yet everything seems to breathe together. The air is the same inside and out. Life pulses like a single organism, and what we call I is just one of its heartbeats. The revelation that there was never separation also brings practical clarity. It changes the way one acts. Automatic reactions give way to conscious response, because the other is no longer other. The good one does is done to oneself. The harm one causes is caused to the whole. Ethics ceases to be an imposition and becomes evidence. Compassion is born from the direct perception that there are no real borders. In the language of quantum physics, we could say that consciousness finally perceives the entanglement that has always existed. No particle is isolated, all participate in the same field. On the human plane, this entanglement is what we call love, the memory that everything is connected. When this memory awakens, fear dissolves, because fear exists only where there is separation. Love is the universe's coherence in the form of sensation. And curiously, this revelation requires no effort. It arrives like a remembrance that has always been there, waiting only for the silence necessary to be perceived. It is a recognition so natural that it seems to have happened 1,000 times before. Perhaps because it has always happened, the universe remembering itself with each conscious breath. Separation was never real, only convenient for the experience of growth. When one understands that there was never any distance between the human and the divine, between matter and consciousness, between sound and silence, the world becomes transparent. Things cease to be just things. Each form vibrates as the expression of something invisible and alive. The gaze changes, and with it the way of touching, of speaking, of existing changes. Everything comes to be treated with reverence, not out of spiritual obligation, but because the sacred reveals itself as the condition of everything that exists. At this point, the old questions, who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Lose their existential weight. They remain beautiful, but no longer demand an answer. The mystery does not need to be solved because it has become a dwelling. The who dissolves into the all, the where dissolves into the here, and the when expands into presence. Consciousness, freed from the search, finally rests. The perception of unity does not eliminate the movement of life. Dualities continue, day and night, birth and death, joy and pain, but they are seen as rhythms, not as conflicts. The universe breathes in polarities, and the awakened human learns to dance between them without getting lost. Balance is not immobility, it is dynamic harmony. When this is understood, peace ceases to be the absence of contrast and becomes the understanding of the cycle. The most striking thing is that, after this revelation, everything becomes simpler. Thinking softens, feeling deepens, and action gains naturalness. Consciousness no longer tries to control the river. It flows with it. And in this flow, life responds. Circumstances rearrange themselves in tune with the new vibration. What once was effort becomes flow. The universe, in recognizing itself in you, begins to move with precise delicacy. There was never separation, and this is the most liberating and at the same time the most humble truth. Because it does not exalt the human, it integrates it. Grandeur ceases to be a conquest and becomes belonging. Life is not something one possesses, it is something in which one participates. Each breath is an act of communion with the whole, and each thought is a wave echoing in the infinite field of existence. And when this perception settles in, there is no return. Not because something is lost, but because everything is found again. Unity is the origin and the destination, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the recognition. The journey ends where it began, in the now. Consciousness at last rests in its original nature, pure, indivisible, and transparent. In this rest, silence is not absence, it is fullness. And the being that once believed itself alone perceives that it has always been the universe, observing itself from within. There was never separation, there was only the temporary forgetting of the whole that you have always been. And it is from this transparency, from this remembrance of unity, that the final communion is born, the state in which the being ceases to be distinguished from the light that passes through it. In this instant, everything is simplified. What once was search becomes recognition, and what seemed like a path reveals itself as a dwelling. Life is no longer something to be reached, but something that is allowed to live through. To be transparency is to let the universe see through your eyes, touch with your hands, breathe in your rhythm. Communion is not union between parts. It is the disappearance of the border. The transparent being does not try to illuminate, he merely does not prevent the light from passing through him. And when this passage is free, the entire world becomes a mirror of the same presence. What was seen as plurality becomes harmony. What was felt as distance reveals itself as continuity. Adoration, service, and silence converge into the same gesture. To exist in full correspondence with the whole. To be transparency is to be communion. It is to recognize yourself not as an isolated individual, but as shared clarity. The universe worships through you, learns through you, loves through you, and the beauty of this lies in not needing to control, in allowing life itself to be the altar where consciousness remembers its luminous origin. If you have felt this silent presence along the way, write in the comments, "I am transparency." That way I will know you have reached the end of this inner crossing. And if you wish to continue exploring this space, where the invisible becomes word, subscribe, so that we can continue together, breathing the same silence, remembering the same universe that passes through us.